and you'll be able to watch this, if you want to go back to it later. So today's webinar will feature editors and authors from the June 2024 special issue of the Journal of Survey Statistics and Methodology on recent innovations and advancements in mixed mode surveys. And I'm really excited to be putting on this webinar. I was a co-editor of the journal, and I think it's really awesome. So thanks everybody for joining this. Like I said, the session is going to be recorded and will be on our DC-AAPOR YouTube channel. I'm Stephanie Coffey, your host for the session. The webinar is brought to you by your DC-AAPOR program committee, and thanks to everybody who helped organize this. So our order of operations today will go as follows. First, we'll hear from one of the editors of the special issue, and then we'll hear from authors of 3 different papers who will all present for about 15 minutes each. During presentations, please mute your mics and use the chat feature in Zoom to enter thoughts and questions. We'll have a few minutes at the end of each presentation for quick clarifying questions, or if maybe we have time for one question or something like that. And I'll watch the clock just to make sure that we get a chance to hear from everyone. Then later, once all our speakers have finished, we'll open the floor for further discussion. And if you're comfortable at that time, you can request to turn on your camera or mics to ask questions and provide feedback directly. Okay. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Cameron McPhee. I'm sure lots of people here already know her. She's our first presenter. She's the chief methodologist at SSRS and has served as the chair for the AAPOR National Standards Committee and as program chair for our own DC-AAPOR. She was one of the 3 guest editors of the special issue, and we're happy to have her here today. Feel free to share your slides, Cameron.
All right. Do you see everything? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie and DC-AAPOR for putting this on. It's really exciting. I love that this special issue is living on. So as Stephanie mentioned, in 2024, early 2024, the editors of JSSAM at the time, Kristen Olson and Catherine Jenny Thompson, reached out to Stephanie, Olga, and myself to think about a special issue for JSSAM post-COVID on changes that we've seen and sort of the impact of all the changes in technology during and after COVID on specifically mixed mode data collection, with the thought that, the great AAPOR task force report in 2019 that looked at transitions to mixed mode was probably getting somewhat out of date, or maybe there were changes and updates that were relevant. So thinking about that, could we come together and think about a special issue and how to frame that special issue? So I'm just going to talk briefly about how we thought about the framing of it for a couple of minutes, and then we'll turn it over to some of the authors. Let me see if I can go forward. There. So the first task really was the call for papers. So, we worked with the editors and together to think about, specifically what we were interested in seeing in the call for papers. Innovations and implementations generally in mixed mode surveys, but we were really interested in sort of emerging contact or data collection modes, like video interviewing and other remote sorts of interviewing, text interviewing, SMS, that may have emerged more ubiquitously during the pandemic, development or applications of statistical methods to estimate probabilities of inclusion when you're dealing with these multi-mode surveys. So thinking about different frames and different modes and how that affects the measurement and the estimation, mode-specific effects and response styles, assessment of different designs for mixed modes. So whether you're looking at concurrent or sequential or other sorts of designs when you're implementing all of these mixed modes, testing and evaluation of the questionnaires and of specific mode effects, and sort of whether there are optimal contexts in which to do this, development and application of statistical methods of adjustment specifically for these mode effects, and thinking about how we can deal with that within this world where we feel like mixed mode is definitely the future. And thinking about mode and mode choice in adaptive designs and tailored surveys, imputation, weighting, stuff like that. So that was all in the call for papers. It was our hope that we would be able to address some of these. A lot of them were touched on in the task force report, but not everything, and it was definitely sort of a growing field of interest. So what did we get out of it? You know, a very quick summary, and there's a cool table in the journal that sort of shows what all the papers are. Um, but it turned out that like of the papers that we received and that were accepted for publication, about half of them were sampled from other surveys. So it was like, you know, using ACS and other sorts of sample surveys as frames. The other half was mostly ABS pretty consistently as their starting frame. So we didn't see as much about mixing and combining frames as we had sort of hoped or thought we might. Um, Most of the papers that presented some kind of experimentation included SMS or email in the contact strategies. We got data from surveys collected in 5 countries: Germany, Jordan, Netherlands, UK, and the United States. Um, Most of the papers we received were either general population surveys or individuals of some particular group. As I note on the next slide, we didn't see a lot of work in the establishment survey space, which I think is still an area that we should work more in. A lot of the papers addressed cost, and 3 really went into the cost modeling, which I thought was great. We all were really excited to see that. And obviously, as expected, nearly all included web in some way. So, you know, when we think mixed mode, it's definitely mixed with web. Um, and then, you know, we talked a lot about what we wanted and what we didn't see. And so I think, you know, the idea was that this would set the stage for what could be the future research in this field. So, you know, again, there were not any submissions that focused on combining multiple frames, which I think is, at least in my world, we're seeing a lot more of that. No establishment surveys, still limited research globally. The 5 countries we were in were primarily, you know, Western or Westernish countries. And I know there's a lot of work going on right now in sort of figuring out how to do surveys in developing countries. I think the mixed mode context would be interesting there. We didn't see any submissions that addressed like concerns about within household sampling when you're dealing with multiple modes. And there were sort of mixed findings about estimation for mode effects. So I think there was still room for more research there. Um, you know, how we can think going forward how sample frames can be augmented, enhanced, and combined to improve mixed mode survey research. And then what are the trade-offs between precision and representation and just the complexity of implementation of these designs? I mean, every mode we add sort of adds new estimation challenges and data weighting and combining challenges and modeling challenges. And is it, what is the bang for the buck that we're getting from there? Um, and you know, as online technology evolves, how does this change, right? Like this is a very fast changing world, and I still feel like even the papers that we received using SMS in 2023 were different than the papers I'm seeing now using SMS in 2025. So, you know, how can we analyze and understand this complex situation? And on that, that's sort of all I've got. I'm happy to answer questions at the end if there are questions specific to putting the full journal together or what we as the editors sort of synthesized from it. But I think the interesting part is listening to the authors.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cameron. Okay, so first up, we have Leah Christian to talk with us. Leah is a Senior Vice President and the Director of the Methodology and Quantitative Social Sciences Department at NORC at University of Chicago. Leah, you can go ahead and share your slides.
All right.
And everyone, what I would just ask is if you have questions and you want to put them in the chat so we make sure we get through them all, or so we don't miss any, please go ahead and do that or drop them in the Q&A. I'll go ahead and monitor both while the speakers are speaking. Thanks, Leah.
Yeah, thanks so much. Can y'all see okay? Awesome. I can't say how excited I was. I'll just say quickly before I jump into the actual presentation to see a special issue on mixed mode surveys. So I feel like I sort of have been in my career the whole time while we've been doing mixed mode surveys, starting with web. So was really excited to see you know, the call come out and be a part of the special issue in this area. And the fun thing about today is that I'll spend a little time on, of course, what we actually presented in the JSSAM article, but also share some results from some newer work that we've been doing, or at least some general findings from that work. And of course, talk about some future directions and areas that we can continue to go. I think Cameron set that up nicely when she's like, the papers I'm seeing on texting are different now than they were 2 years ago. So hopefully we'll touch on a little bit of that today as well. So first up, I think we all know what texting is, but just to kind of level set, what I'm, most focused on today is really that kind of how we can use text messaging in supporting our mixed mode designs for outreach and recruitment. I think, where we are now is in a much different place than probably 5 years ago, but I'll say, texting has definitely become more ubiquitous. It started out as really short, simple messages, generally only between mobile devices or mobile users. And of course, it's gotten much more complex. We can have, pictures, video, a lot more kind of multimedia in our messaging. And then with that, of course, pretty much everyone has a smartphone and is using messaging in some form or fashion on most days. And so it's really become a dominant mode of communication for a lot of folks, or at least preferred, I'll say, a primary mode of communication. And the other good news as a data person and a survey researcher is that we're increasingly getting more and more data actually about the success of the actual campaigns or not. So things like delivery, read receipts, other kind of metrics that we're sort of used to from our other modes, those have really expanded quite a bit to help us understand how our texting campaigns are performing. Hopefully not too much new here, but I think people like the high level numbers. So as I said, 90% have a smartphone, including 97% that have a cell phone and can at least receive simple types of text messages. People are online all the time, but at least daily for most folks, and a growing number there at 40+% that are online almost constantly. I think one of the other exciting things, there's lots of text sent, but the open rate being pretty high, I think is one thing that is kind of exciting about text messages, partly because they're short, so it's, sort of easy to take a quick look, but, when I think many of us wonder sometimes how much of our mail that we send out is getting opened, nice to be able to get some metrics on open rates and things. There we go. And I'd say today, like the predominant use we're seeing is texting for kind of recruitment outreach or contacting potential survey respondents. And so some of the ways we've seen that, text invitations, of course, text reminders, and also like appointment confirmation reminders and interviewer type surveys, and or video interviewing, I should say too. And then I'd say with the primary way we're seeing it is like a text push to web as opposed to sort of push to phone or other modes. So I think the biggest kind of bang for the buck, so to speak, with texting is that, getting the link in there, getting people straight to the web survey. And then there's also, it's interesting because it really started probably 15 years ago, I want to say, texting data collection, and it started in some of those emerging, countries and where lots of people had simple, cell phones and could really do some simple data collection. I think there's a lot more we can do there, and I won't talk too much about that in terms of our own research, but we'll come back to that kind of in the future directions as well. Some of the benefits that we've seen with texting so far, potential to decrease non-response bias. So certain groups that are especially prefer texting. Some are also some of the groups that are sometimes harder to reach through other modes like mail, et cetera. Texting can be a cost savings. And can also just add another mode into the mix. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But part of what we're seeing is that kind of mode switching in the outreach strategy can be really helpful. And one of the super exciting things about texting is you get responses really quickly. So even to the web survey, like even if it's not a text data collection, you're getting that the data collection really quickly when it's a text to web type. Most people are responding to that text within the day in most cases, and even beyond that, but certainly most within a day. There's a lot of things to think about with texting that I'm going to say I'm not going to get into today, just in the interest of time, especially around legal and technical type things. But I did think I'd quickly at least mention kind of this difference between SMS and MMS. So our simple messages were kind of what people like when texting first came out, that was sort of all that we had. And I'd say also was a lot of the limitations that early research kind of found. It's really short. It's hard to sort of, get something persuasive, in a short SMS texting. But because all cell phones, can receive them, it is a quick way, especially for things like appointment reminders and things in panels that, is still used today. I'd say predominantly most of the work is in MMS, where there are those multimedia messages that allow for that pictures, video, audio, et cetera, that I mentioned earlier. And you have a lot more flexibility in the length too. So still short, but you can at least get 3 or 4 sentences in there in terms of being able to tell people about the survey. So let's get in a little bit to the research that we shared in the JSSAM article, and it all comes from an ABS study, address-based sample, and for the National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Recreation. And so this was a nationally representative survey. It's where mixed mode, so people were able to complete via web, phone, and paper in terms of data collection. And because we're interested in people who do these certain kinds of activities, there's a screener instrument to identify those who participate in things like fishing, hunting, or wildlife recreation. And so one of the nice things about that is we could collect contact information in the screener and also consent to texting. And so it was, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then there were 3 waves of the study, and the work today we'll focus on some experiments we did in wave 2 of that. And so we had some results from both the screener and wave 1 to help inform the design, which was really helpful. So just to take a quick look at our experimental groups, one is we stratified the sample in 2 ways, into 2 groups. One who we've kind of labeled group A, or cooperative respondents. These are folks who actually completed that wave 1 survey that I mentioned after receiving a text message. So we kind of think of them as both cooperative and sort of text friendly. And then group B includes folks that completed wave 1, but not from the direct text message, or didn't receive that text, or that didn't respond in wave 1. So they could have responded to their screener. Even if they didn't respond to wave 1, we picked them back up in wave 2. So, and later you'll see, just overall completion rates, right, are higher with the more cooperative group. And so you kind of see that in some of the results as well. And then in terms of the experiments, we had kind of focus on sequencing and the time of messaging. And so I'm going to mostly focus on the sequencing today because, spoiler alert, the timing didn't matter much. So we always don't talk about our findings that are not significant less. So, but I did want to acknowledge that we did kind of play with sending those texts in the morning versus afternoon. But most of our work focused on sending invites versus early or late text reminders. So with that cooperative group that I mentioned, we wanted to send them all an invite because we knew they were responsive to texting. So everyone in that group got an invite, and then, roughly half, as you can see, got an early reminder, and the other half a late reminder. And I'll show what that looks like a little bit in the contract strategy in just a second. And then in the third group, we actually could, or the group B, we could experiment and have 3 treatments there for sequencing. And so we experimented with how does an invite compare to those early and late reminders. I'm a really visual person, so I always like to see what this looks like in terms of the actual contact strategy. And so you can see here, this is that, group A first, they all got the text invitation, and then that early text group got the text reminder here, right after the letter invitation and before the first postcard reminder. And then the second group got it after that that first postcard reminder, but before still, getting additional postcard and PAPI mailings. Obviously, in a help saving costs, the earlier you can get responses in, from the text can help save costs on your later mailings. So just a quick look at sort of the completion rates over the field period. So here, again, we have the 2 groups in the group A. So the early text reminder group is here in orange, and you see this nice kind of large, boost from that text reminder. And similarly, but less, less of a big boost from the purple group in the late text reminder. We didn't label all of them, but these kind of dotted gray lines that you see are the mailing. So you can kind of see how it interacted, and there's still some likely residual benefits from the mailings, I'll say, in some of these cases too. And then in terms of what that looked like in terms of final completion rates, we had just under or 77.6% in the early reminder group and 72.8% in the late reminder. So we'll talk more about kind of implications here, but definitely that early reminder seemed to be a big boost, and even kind of kept a significant higher response or completion rate through at the end of the field period. In the other group, as I mentioned, we had 3 treatments. So the first group got the text invitation, but then all sort of mail reminders. And then the early text group got, and the late text both got a letter invitation, and then kind of similarly, the text reminders. In this case, the early one was, again, right after the invitation, but the late one was even later in the field period. And so it was after, like, really kind of a last ditch almost kind of effort. And then here we have the 3 lines, kind of similar groups, the text invite in the dark kind of black line, and you see that jump, right away, even before that first mail contact came. So that just, that was sent, almost a week in advance of when most people got the letter. And then you also see the bumps here in orange and purple from the early and late text as well. These differences were not significant at the end of the field period. So, and also you can see the completion rates lower, kind of as I mentioned, just because they're not as cooperative as those respondents that I mentioned in Group A. So just some of the kind of key findings here. We did see that both invites and reminders can boost response during the field period. A reminder that we use the invite here because this was a longitudinal study where we already had, other contacts and familiarity with these folks. I think text invite for a study where you have no contact yet is probably a different case, and we don't see that as often, I think, being successful. So I think important to think about this within that longitudinal context. That said, the early text reminder can certainly help kind of boost response early and also get responses in more quickly. So the response kind of time was reduced from 8 to 5 days for that early text reminder group, which helped save costs of later mailings, et cetera. As I kind of alluded to, the time of day didn't have a significant impact on the various measures we looked at. So I think more to still come there on like day of week and other things, but in general, people didn't see a big impact from whether it was in the morning versus the afternoon. We looked at a lot of other measures. I didn't share all the slides here, many of which are in the paper around kind of data quality, in particular item non-response, response speed, kind of within the interview itself. And so we didn't see differences really across the experimental groups there, and thankfully item non-response was relatively low overall. I think not surprisingly, you get a lot of smartphone completes when you text people. So most people are still going from their smartphone and going directly into that survey. So we did some later experiments in a subsequent wave of this survey, and found that when you send an email reminder, people are more likely to kind of split across smartphone and computer, whereas texting, people are definitely going to want to answer on their phone itself. So as I mentioned, I wanted to kind of pivot and share a few other nuggets from other research we've done since the article came out. And I've kind of grouped this. So the first slide here talks about some findings in particular around contact modes and sequencing. And so this one's a long time finding, but I think continue to reinforce that using multiple modes of outreach improves response. So why many of us moved to mixed mode surveys decades ago, and why they continue to be really important. And one of the things I think that was really interesting that we found in a different study, still an ABS kind of study, address-based sample, general population in the US, but we actually found that, like, in a mostly male contact strategy, a text reminder performed better than kind of doing another postcard reminder, sort of mid to late in the field period. And so Here, it was mostly mail. There was some phone prompting for the other outreach, but I think that, juxtaposition of a different mode and, again, was more powerful in this case than the postcard, of which they'd gotten, already one before. We also found that, it was definitely more cost effective than sending that postcard reminder. So I want to be really clear, mail remains, this is not a mail presentation, but mail remains a critically important mode in our surveys. But part of what we're seeing is that, you sometimes want to interrupt that flow and also get in text, phone, some of these other modes of outreach. And I think, again, common finding, it's been around for a long time, but we know multiple contacts works. It works within a setting where we're using texting as well. So we do a large scale survey of registered voters around election time, and it's a very short survey. So it's like literally, a week before the elections. It's a very short turnaround. And in this case, we experimented with sort of mail only, text only, and then a combination. As you can imagine, very few outreach attempts within this short period. But even there, in that kind of short 1 week period, we found that the combination of mail and texting performed better than mail alone or texting alone. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but texting is definitely something you should be thinking about in your panel and longitudinal surveys. You've developed relationships with people. You've already established that trust and legitimacy. You can often gain consent at earlier waves or surveys. And so that also allows, just on the technical side, a lot more options for how you text when you have consent. And just again, it for many, what we see in many of our panel and longitudinal studies, it's actually the preferred mode of contact for folks. So when we think about the messaging, I talked a little bit about MMS and SMS earlier. MMS messages do outperform SMS. So we experimented with that again in that same quick turnaround survey of registered voters, and did direct experimental treatments around MMS and SMS, and more people responded to the MMS texting than SMS. When it comes to the actual words, I'm going to go with still very mixed. So I don't think we've solved these are the exact words you should put in your text to be most persuasive. I think there are some best practices, that are emerging, even in this environment, right? Short communication, focusing on the respondent, what benefits might be to them of participating, things like that, certainly are important. But probably having done maybe 20 different wording experiments across probably 4 different surveys, we still find that, like, when you compare head-to-head messaging, you often get non-significant findings, even kind of drilling down within different groups and things. So I think still more work to do there. And also, depends on how it relates into the rest of your contacts in the study. And then lastly, kind of thinking more about like data collection type things to consider. So I mentioned this earlier, people who respond to text are more likely to respond by web. And we actually even compared this to, we did an experiment where we compared just sending the web link or providing a phone number where people can call in. And even there, predominantly all responses via the web, and no significant kind of uptick in the phone by providing the phone number. And, as I said, the use of texting definitely increases response by smartphone. And so you really want to make sure your survey is mobile friendly if you're going to use texting in your contact strategy. And then again, we've seen this across studies that you get most of those responses in the same or next day. And so especially from a data collection perspective, if you're trying to track a recent event or things like that, texting can be really helpful to sort of get those responses in quickly when you need a really fast turnaround. Just to end on some kind of future thoughts and directions, I think in many of our surveys, texting is now kind of a key contact mode we at least consider, if not always use, in our mixed mode designs. But there is still work to do. I think kind of that best sequence of modes of contact and when to introduce texting is still, there's still some work to be done there, especially I'd say after some of those initial invites in your kind of cross-sectional fresh sample surveys. Frequency with texting, we could text people every day. please don't do that. But what exactly that right optimal timing is and frequency, how quick is too quick? I think some of those questions we're still thinking about. In most of the studies we've done, we have not tried to send multiple text reminders within a week, for instance. So we are spreading those out over at least multiple weeks. As I mentioned earlier, the time of day didn't seem to have an impact, but what about day of week? So are there specific days that might be better? Do weekends perform differently from weekdays, et cetera? And that probably relates to your population and study. If you're doing an establishment survey, you probably want to do more texting in the weekdays versus, perhaps with household surveys and things, you might want to do more on the weekends. I think, we all have looked at texting to help improve representation. And I think there's more work to be done here. And that was part of why we experimented with trying to push people to phone, because we know some of our phone friendly folks are particularly different than our web friendly folks. So I think we are seeing some promise here with representation, but I think still more to be done to probably really help where we need. And then a lot of our work, at least, has been in English or English and Spanish. And so we're still, I think, thinking a lot about for other populations where we might need additional languages, what does that look like? And when it comes to data collection, as I mentioned, I think some of the ways that we've been thinking about this, one is just, so far, I'd say the research suggests that short or simple surveys are ideal for texting. So probably don't want to take that hour-long interview right away with complex questions and things into a text mode. But I think more experimentation with short, simple surveys, especially in the moment. It's a really great way to kind of get those in the moment type observations or behaviors, likely supplemented, other data collection you might be doing. And then also, some work we've started and others on kind of how we can use kind of AI in our surveys for administration, kind of AI interviewers or things, regardless of whether there's an actual interviewer, I'll say, or avatar of some kind. And so texting, it's a nice, obviously there's that kind of conversational nature of texting would also allow for kind of AI assisted interviewing. So thank y'all so much. It takes a group. So even though you're hearing from me today, all this work I talked about today, lots of collaborators that I wanted to make sure got included. And then we do have a summary that we put out kind of last year of some of our research on texting. There's some new stuff that's not in there that I shared today, but it's kind of a good summary of a lot of our work in this space, links to some of the presentations, et cetera. So I will stop there and turn it back to Stephanie.
Great. Thanks so much, Leah. So we have time for maybe one quick question before we move to our next presenter. I don't see anything in the chat, but if anybody wants to raise their hands and ask one quick question, or we'll come back to questions at the end of the webinar. Even if someone doesn't have a question, can someone raise their hand and make sure that you can raise your hand? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Summer. Great. Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll give Leah a break and we'll transition to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Mickey Jackson. Mickey's the Vice President of Data Science and Innovation at SSRS. Mickey, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, that'd be great.
All right, everything visible and audible?
Looks great. Sounds great.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm going to be switching gears a little bit and talking about a study that primarily uses mail and phone as contact modes. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the use of adaptive design in that type of design. Want to start by acknowledging my co-authors on this paper, who are both from the Center for Health Policy Research at UCLA. This paper primarily uses data from the California Health Interview Survey, or CHIS, which they sponsor. And we're very appreciative that they've allowed us to share these results in various forums. And of course, just want to emphasize that everything I say here is my opinion alone. So let me start by giving some background both about adaptive designs in general and about CHIS specifically. broadly, when we talk about adaptive designs, these terms kind of have different definitions depending on who you're talking to. I tend to, this is the definition I like. I think of an adaptive design as any differential targeting of data collection interventions based on some observable characteristics of the sampled units. And I think it's useful to make a distinction between static and dynamic adaptive designs. In static designs, who gets what intervention is entirely pre-specified before data collection begins. So here you're not really making any use of paradata for the targeting. You're just relying on whatever auxiliary data you have before data collection. In dynamic designs, you're making decisions, at least to some extent, on who gets what intervention during data collection. So this opens up the possibility of using paradata from the earlier phases of data collection to help decide who should get what intervention. So the adaptive design that I'll be talking about today is an example of a dynamic adaptive design. Say a little bit about CHIS. It's a very large-scale annual study of the California household population. Like a lot of these types of studies, it used to be done using RDD, but transitioned to mixed mode ABS in 2019 as the primary frame. Sample design, suffice to say, it's complicated. There are really two salient features that I want to highlight that are relevant to our analytic strategy. The first is that every year the sample is divided into 25 random replicates, and the release of these replicates is staggered throughout the year. The other thing I'll note is that although it's an annual study, the data get released in 2-year increments to allow people to pool the samples to allow for analysis of very small geographic areas. So what we do is essentially for every pairing of an even year and an odd year, we try to hold the sample design and the contact protocols largely constant to allow for that kind of pooling. This is what a typical data collection wave looks like for CHIS. So we start with a mail push to web phase at which each sampled address can receive up to 4 mailing attempts. Those who do not respond via push to web then transition to the outbound Katie phase. And this applies to the subset of addresses that have a matched phone number available from the sample vendor, which for CHIS is roughly 70% of the sample. The standard protocol here is for every matched address to receive up to 6 dialing attempts. And it's in that Katie phase that adaptive design comes in for CHIS. So we started incorporating adaptive design principles about midway through 2022. The primary driver of this was essentially operational. We were looking at some pretty significant cost overruns from the dialing. So we needed to find a way to reduce the volume of dialing while, of course, trying to minimize the impact on response rates and sample composition. So if we think of adaptive design as always kind of an implicit optimization problem, here we're really optimizing on cost, but subject to implicit constraints on sample productivity and non-response bias. So this is just a summary of how adaptive design currently works in CHIS. There are actually 2 different intervention points that we use for the Katie phase. One of the intervention points takes place at the very beginning of the Katie phase, so before dialing starts for a given wave. And the outcome of this first intervention is that some cases have their max number of calls set to just 1. Then for those who do get to the third call, the second intervention takes place after that third call. And the outcome of that intervention is that we have some cases that get retired at that point. We don't resume dialing them. Everybody else, we resume dialing out to the usual max of 6. Now, the paper that we published in the special issue focuses on the call 3 intervention, which was actually the first one that we rolled out. And so since we have limited time today, I'm going to talk about the call 3 intervention. We have since put together some results from the call 1 intervention, which rolled out a little bit later. That's been shared in other forums, so if anybody wants to see those results, please just send me an email. I'd be happy to share them. But we'll focus on call 3. So what happens at call 3 is this. Every record that reaches the third dialing attempt gets paused after that attempt and scored with a response propensity model. So basically, every active case is given a score ranging from 0 to 1, reflecting the predicted probability that they will eventually respond if we keep dialing them. Those whose response propensity is below a certain threshold get retired. So those are the people we stop dialing after that third call. Everybody who's above the cut point resumes dialing out to the usual max of 6 attempts. And I'll mention the cut point that we use for determining who keeps getting called. That varies to some extent across strata, which helps us to control the impact on sample composition. So the strata that are harder to reach, we use a more generous standard. We only stop calling them if the response propensity is really low. On the other end, for the strata where we know we're going to reach our targets, we only retire them if their response propensity, or we only keep dialing them if their response propensity is really high. The models that we use for this were pre-trained on an earlier wave of CHIS. So the dependent variable for these models is final response status, conditional on not having responded after the first 3 call attempts. And really the most important predictors in these models are the paradata variables from the first 3 calls. So the outcome from each of those calls and the duration for each of those calls. There's a couple of other address level variables in the model. It's basically what kind of phone number we have, whether we have a second phone number, and again, there's stratum code to allow us to vary that cut point across strata. So really the intuition here is that we're using the outcomes of the first 3 calling attempts to predict how likely they would be to respond if we kept calling them, and retiring the ones who we think that we're not going to get as a result of additional dialing. Now, the driving force here was operational. We really needed to reduce these dialing costs, so we were not able to roll this out experimentally. It was rolled out for everybody. But what was helpful is that it was rolled out in kind of a phased manner. So again, this intervention at call 3 was rolled out first as part of CHIS 2022. We added the pre-dialing intervention towards the end of CHIS 2023. So again, we'll focus on evaluating the call 3 intervention since that's what the paper focused on. So although this wasn't done as an experiment, we were able to leverage the phased rollout to conduct a difference in difference analysis. So the first difference here comes from that phased rollout. In CHIS 2021, the adaptive design didn't apply to anybody. But because of the pooled design that we use, the sample design and data collection procedures were otherwise very similar to 2022. So we're going to call 2021 the untreated group. In 2022, we launched the adaptive design around the time that outbound dialing started for wave 9. So waves 9 through 25, we're going to call the fully treated waves because anybody who got to the third call in those waves encountered the adaptive design. Waves 1 through 8, we're going to call partially treated. These started outbound dialing before we were using the adaptive design, but still had some people who hadn't yet reached their third call when it did. So some, but not all of the records in 1 through 8 encountered the adaptive design. So that's where we get sort of our first source of variability. The second source comes from the fact that the intervention point was at call number 3. Which means that by definition, it could not have affected any outcomes through call 3. Any impact of the adaptive design should only show up after calls 4 through 6. So essentially what we're going to do is compare 2021 and 2022 with respect to the incremental effect of calls 4 through 6. Now, for this estimator to have a causal interpretation, we need to assume that in the absence of adaptive design, the incremental effects of calls 4 through 6 would have been the same in 2021 and 2022. In the difference in difference world, this is called the parallel trends assumption. So that's the intuition. The paper has a lot more detail, including the details of the regressions that we used for statistical testing. But the nice thing about difference in difference analysis is that it tends to show up really nicely on graphs. So I'll just confine myself to showing descriptive estimates here. So first looking at completion rates, what we see here is the cumulative completion rate as of 3 points in data collection. So point number 1 is before any dialing, so just looking at the results after the push to web phase. Point number 2 is after the first 3 calls, and then the final point is after all dialing is completed. So the first thing to note here is that the incremental effect of those first 3 calls is roughly the same across all of these samples, which is what we really like to see in a difference in difference analysis. It suggests that that parallel trends assumption is plausible. And then you can see that in the second half of dialing, there's a little bend in the curve, but only for the treated waves. In particular, the incremental effect of the second half of dialing was about 0.3 percentage points lower in the fully treated waves in 2022 than it was in 2021. So under this difference in difference assumption, that's our estimate of the causal effect of the adaptive design on the final completion rate. So now we'll look at sample composition, and this is really important in CHIS. California, of course, is a very, very diverse state, and it's very important to us and to the sponsor that the responding sample to CHIS fully reflect that aspect of the population that we're studying. So there are a bunch of different groups for which we have sample size targets in CHIS. What you see here is the prevalence among the responding sample of all of these demographics as of the same 3 points in data collection. Now, as it turns out, only 2 of these groups show statistically significant differences in the regressions that we're using to do statistical testing here. We have what looks like a significant improvement in the representation of African Americans and a statistically significant decrease in the prevalence of responses in one of the Asian languages that we offer the survey in. However, if we take a closer look at these, there's some reason for skepticism that these effects are attributable to the adaptive design. The significant effect actually only shows up in the partially treated waves. And if this was attributable to the adaptive design, of course, we'd really expect it to also show up and be larger in the fully treated waves, but that's actually not the case with these outcomes. The other thing to note here, I think, is that if you look at the plots for these 2 groups, it's really not clear that the parallel trends assumption holds. The incremental effect of the first 3 calls, which are unaffected by the adaptive design, are not consistent between 2021 and 2022. So this is kind of the downside of having to rely on a quasi-experimental analytic methods, is sometimes the underlying assumptions are not met. So I think, when it comes to what we can say about the effect of the adaptive design, we do have evidence of a small decrease in the final completion rate. We don't have strong evidence of a meaningful impact on sample composition, but that's partly because the parallel trends assumption doesn't seem to hold with respect to these particular outcomes. So generally speaking, we're pretty happy with how this worked out. We were able to substantially reduce the amount of dialing that was required, and therefore the variable costs associated with that KD phase, with what we consider to be a sufficiently minimal impact on sample productivity and on the composition of respondents. So this has now been running, this has been a part of the CHIS protocol since 2022. It's very automated at this point. It basically runs completely in the background. The one thing I want to emphasize is that it did take a lot of work up front to get to the point where that was possible. Again, these models really rely heavily on the paradata that comes out of our KD system. And so, this really required a lot of coordination with our data processing team and with our teleops team to make sure that that paradata was always coming out in a standardized format, right? Obviously, if you're using these types of models, it's very important that a particular code always mean the same thing across different waves of data collection. So there's definitely some fixed cost associated with getting something like this set up. Now for CHIS, because it's, an ongoing annual study and a very large study, the cost savings from reducing dialing, vastly dwarfed the fixed costs that were associated with getting this all set up. But I think it is important not to sleep on the effort that's required to make something like this possible in kind of an automated fashion. we can't just have the data scientists, build models and start running them. It's very important to make sure that the inputs and the outputs are standardized so that this can happen seamlessly. So with that, if you want to know more, the top reference here is the paper in the special issue. I'm happy to take any questions in this session, or feel free to send me an email. My contact information is there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mickey. So we do have a few minutes for questions, and I see one in the Q&A. Okay, so John Lee has written, which CADI system are you using to produce this paradata, and are you getting information from soft phone systems like Cisco to help with that? You're muted, Mickey.
Sorry about that. That's a great question, and one that I will only partially be able to answer, although I see Summer is on this webinar, so she might be able to help me answer it in the chat. So we use Forsta. That's our system. I don't know the answer about the soft phone system, unfortunately.
Summer, if you want to hop off mute, and if you want to add to that, that would be fine.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, so we use Confirmit's Forsta Plus system, and the Sitel dialer does feed a lot of information into both our inbound system and the program. So yes, the soft phone information is fed into the data, and I do believe it is part of what is used in the adaptive design.
Thank you for rescuing me there, Summer.
Yeah, no problem. I was typing, but I couldn't find the unmute button.
Cool. I actually have a question too, since we have a minute. So I think I've talked to Mickey lots about adaptive designs. We both work on them. I'm just sort of curious, when you worked with the CHIS survey management team, can you talk a little bit? You mentioned sort of the requirement that the representation of different strata were sort of maintained when you kind of decide to sort of stop work on cases. Were there other challenges that you found suggesting this type of dynamic design to the team?
I think this was the first time that we had done something like this. We've since rolled it out to a few of our other big ABS studies. So I think there definitely was some. I think there was definitely some work to like get everybody aligned on terminology and on sort of why this would be helpful. Just again, it was something new and we hadn't done it before. But I think I think once we were able to have those conversations, it was pretty clear to everybody why this would be useful, and we were able to work through the operational hurdles. So I don't think we found it to be that hard to get everybody on the same page about this. And I see Summers raising her hand, so she's from the ops side, so she might have a different opinion on this.
I do agree, but I think the number one piece that helped kind of the clients buy in was letting them know that we could still be flexible, even though we had automated the system. Like for instance, you see that the Hispanic or Spanish speaking response rate is very high, and it's super important given the demographics of California. And so a lot of times, a lot of years, we make the decision to kind of ignore some of the adaptive design rules for specific sample types to make sure that the client is comfortable that we're still putting in the effort where they need to see better results. So no, for everything mixed mode for sure, but definitely in an automated system, ensuring that flexibility is still possible even when there's like a program running in the background has been really vital to us. And you have to be nimble with something like this. And I think that really helped the client sign on to an automation they couldn't really like touch and feel,
That's a great point. Yeah.
Sure, that is terrific. I agree. Okay, thanks. Any last short questions for Mickey? We'll have time at the end. Okay, great. Thanks, Mickey. So we'll go ahead and hear from our final speaker today, Wenchen Yu. Wenchen recently earned her PhD in survey methodology from University of Michigan, and she's now a postdoctoral researcher at Duke University. You want to go ahead and share your slides, Wenchen?
Can you see my slides fine?
Yep, they look perfect.
Okay, I'll get started. Thank you everyone for being here for me to share my research. The topic today is improving inferences based on survey data connected using mixed mode designs, and it's actually the first chapter in my dissertation. And I appreciate my advisors for their guidance on this project. As this audience is very familiar that mixed mode designs have become very common for survey data connection. By using mixed mode designs, it can improve sample balance at potentially a lower survey cost. However, the disadvantage of doing so is introducing mode-specific measurement error, which are often referred to as mode effects. And one of the most well-documented sources of mode effects is social desirability bias, which is often larger in interviewer-administered mode compared to those in the self-administered modes. In this case, how can we best analyze the pooled data connected with the mixed mode designs? Before I go into details, I'll first introduce the context of of my study, a raw parameter study, which is the largest repository of public opinion data in the Middle East and North Africa region. It covers 15 countries, and there have been 6 waves since 2006. In 2020, they have switched from face-to-face only to a mixed mode of face-to-face and telephone in 3 countries. Measuring regime support can be a sensitive question, especially in authoritarian countries. And in literature, there are mixed evidence on mode effects due to social desirability bias between telephone and face-to-face modes. Some reported that telephone is associated with larger social desirability bias compared to face-to-face, and some reported that there are no big difference between the 2 modes. In this case, how do we make inferences to incorporate the potential mode effects? So the study of the aim of our study is to provide inference tools to analyze mixed mode data connected with randomized designs illustrated in this raw parameter study. And I'll briefly go through the literature review. On the first line of research, they typically calibrate mixed mode data to approximate what would have been connected with a single mode, and they impute individuals for the unpreferred mode. So they assume mode effects are present, and we know what the preferred mode is. The second line of research, they develop mode-specific estimate level weights so that the resulting estimate is optimized in terms of the mean squared error. And this type of approach, they do not aim to tease out the mode effects. So we propose novel approaches so that they can tease out mode effects when they are present and won't backfire when there are no mode effects. We assume a normally distributed outcome Y, and we are interested in inferring its population mean. Borrow from the causal inference literature, we only observe marginal means, UA and UB, and marginal variances, sigma A squared and sigma B squared, corresponding to the observed mode. And we assumed the outcome under the unobserved mode is considered as a counterfactual. Just like the typical setup in causal inference, we will never be able to jointly observe YAI and YBI. Therefore, we cannot estimate the correlation, but we will assume the correlation to be 0 for the proposed approaches, but we will also illustrate that our inference is not sensitive to this correlation. We have to assume that at least one mode provides unbiased estimate of the population mean, so that the population mean is estimatable in this case. And we consider 2 settings. When we have some prior information on the preferred direction, and when there is no such information. Here, preferred direction reflect the people's beliefs on which direction is less biased. For example, whether a smaller estimate is less biased or a larger estimate is less biased. And we will choose the smaller value between UA and UB if a smaller one is less biased, and choose the larger one between UA and UB if we believe a larger estimate is less biased. And when there is no such information, we will compute the average of UA and UB. And now I'll illustrate the three approaches considering when we have some prior information available. The first one, we named it as testimator, which can be considered as the frequentist model selection. We will first test the equality of variances and then test the equality of means. We will test the estimates of means and variances if we fail to reject the null hypothesis. And if we do reject the null hypothesis, we'll take the estimate in the preferred direction. For the second approach, the Bayesian approach, that's the Bayesian version of model selection. We first use estimates of an effect size to determine whether the means are the same. Then we'll draw population mean from pooled data if evidence suggests equal means. And we can consider different cutoff values if we want a more sensitive or more conservative method. If evidence suggests different means, then we'll take the estimate in the preferred direction. The third approach is the Bayesian model averaging approach, where we consider four models that differ on whether specifying different means and/or different variances. We will combine the four models with weights equals to the posterior probability that a given model is correct. We evaluate the approaches through a simulation study, where the true data is generated from this bivariate normal model, where UA is specified at 0 and the sigma A squared is specified at 1. The correlation is 0.95, but we also tried 0.5 and 0.75 for the correlation and find that the results do not differ much. So we will vary UB and sigma B squared to implement different level of mode effects. We assume mode A provides unbiased responses and mode B produces positive mode effects. If we have information, then we assume the information says a smaller estimate is preferred. And we compare the three proposed approaches with two naive approach. The first one is always taking the smaller estimate of YA bar and YB bar. The second approach is pulling the data and we consider the sample size to be 500, 250 for each mode, and the number of simulation is 500 times. This slide gives the bias of the simulation when some prior information is available. So here, all the colorful shapes are by the proposed approaches, and the black and the white are represent the naive approach, with plus in a circle representing always using the smaller estimate, and the open plain circle represents pulling the data. We considered 9 scenarios. The specification of each scenario is outlined in the table on the right. So for scenarios 1 and 2 that represent no mode effects, we see in this case the proposed approaches can reduce bias compared to taking the smaller estimate. From scenarios 3 to 9, when mode effects are present and become increasingly large, the proposed approaches can lessen bias compared to pooling the data. And we see that also for the model averaging approach, it has slightly larger positive bias in scenarios 3 and 4, and that's because the model averaging approach compared to other proposed approach, they are less sensitive to small mode effects. And this slide gives the coverage rate for the same setting when some prior information is available. And the story is similar. And I will note here that in scenarios 3 to 9, the naive approach of pulling the data has nearly 0 coverage rate because they're so low, so they're shown by arrows here. When there are no mode effects, the proposed approaches have better coverage than taking the smaller estimate. And when mode effects are present from scenarios 3 to 9, the proposed approaches can achieve better coverage than pooling the data. So that's what I'm going to show about the simulation. And now I'm going to illustrate the approaches when we apply it to some real data. We consider the Jordan experiment in the ARA parameter study, where the outcome we are looking at is the satisfaction with the government. The higher the measure, the more satisfied a participant is with the government. Because in this case, reporting low satisfaction can be risky for the respondents, so we consider a smaller estimate to be less biased. And in their survey design, they implemented a randomized mode assignment. And we compute the non-response weights to account for the differential non-response to the telephone interview. Unlike in the simulation study, there is the complex sample design we need to account for, and we do that by compute design-based statistics for each mode and plug them into the three approaches. And here are the results. So the table on the left shows the estimates by the proposed approaches, and the table on the right shows the estimates by the naive approaches. We see that when we assume a smaller estimate is preferred, the three approaches provide a similar estimate to using face-to-face mode alone. This means that the approaches detect substantial mode effects and determine that face-to-face alone provides a better estimate of the population mean in this case. And when there is no information, we see that the three proposed approaches give results similar to pooling the data, but the interval is much wider to reflect the increased uncertainty in this scenario. And here are some conclusions. When we have prior information about preferred directions, the approaches can provide robust inferences. And when there is no information, the approaches can provide intervals with nominal coverage rates, which are not shown in this presentation, but is shown in the paper. The three approaches can also be adapted to account for complex survey designs. And here are some directions for future work. We can account for also non-randomized mixed mode designs using propensity score adjustment. And we can also incorporate other type of information like preferred modes. And in this study, we focus on the continuous outcome, but they can be extended to binary outcomes. And also it's possible to try to find cutoff values that minimize mean squared error in the test estimator approach. That's all for my presentation. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Wenchen. Yeah, so I'll open the floor to questions for Wenchen for a few minutes first, and then we can sort of go back to the overall group. And I will use my prerogative to ask the first question. So I was kind of wondering, for the testimator and the Bayesian approach, when you reject the null hypothesis, right, that either your mean doesn't match or your variances don't match, your method potentially throws away some data, right? You sort of say, we'll take the estimate that comes from the preferred mode that is kind of in the direction we expect. I'm thinking about all the survey researchers on this call right now who are worried about sort of falling response rates and how hard it is to actually get people to respond to surveys. And that might make people uncomfortable. I know like at census, people would be like, you're throwing out data, this is terrible. So do you have thoughts on your method, you know, where you exclude data from estimates versus some of what I think of as maybe more common methodology where, I mean, obviously ignoring the differences is not great, but like where maybe they take the not preferred mode and try to adjust it to the preferred mode distribution to sort of be able to leverage that data? Like, what do you think the pros and cons of those two methods are?
I think that's a very great question, and also per perspective, we also receive receive comment because survey researchers don't want to throw out data, but I guess because for each outcome, there can be a mode that provides less biased data. So even if for this particular outcome, some mode is not being very helpful, but their data can still be used for other type of outcomes. And additionally, I guess I can take a minute to think about the question and
Yeah.
can give
You
more
can write
thoughts to
in
it.
you can write in the chat. Absolutely. That's totally fine. Thanks for your time. I'm just curious because I think there's obviously pros and cons with all of these kind of model-based adjustment methods. So I was just curious for your thoughts. Thanks. Other questions for Wenchan, or we can open this back up to the entire panel for other questions. Okay. So we have a little bit of time. So with our remaining time, we can open the floor for questions. Raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and I can call on you so we don't accidentally talk over each other. Or to get the discussion started, I've dropped some questions for both Leah and Mickey into the chat. And so if Leah or Mickey, if you want to hop off mute and address either any of those questions or all of them, even if they're not addressed to you, it's okay if you have thoughts. Mickey, I know we were talking about the text surveys that your organization is doing too, so you may also have follow-ups to thoughts that Leah has as well. So
I can start if you want, Stephanie.
yeah, that'd be awesome.
And I'm going to first say something that isn't in your questions, but is just one thing I didn't spend a lot of time on was kind of the consented versus unconsented texting. And so I'll just say quickly, we do both depending on the type of survey and things. And currently with unconsented texting, we only send MMS, and through kind of what's called peer-to-peer texting, there is some software and kind of companies out there that can still help you facilitate, but the idea is it's still a human sending to a human, hence the peer-to-peer texting part. So in those cases, we only use MMS. It's what is the preferred kind of method there. So and then I'll answer that part and kind of keep going. So I think generally I'll say we haven't done, I think the experiment maybe that you suggested, which is like getting it down to what you can send via SMS and then comparing that sent via MMS versus sort of a more expanded one. So the experiment we did do, we had a little bit additional information on kind of the survey. We had the logo. That was kind of one of the big things with MMS. So they weren't kind of apples to apples in that sense. We're sort of maximizing for MMS versus SMS, and did find the MMS kind of more successful. It's a good idea though, I think, to see if sort of the more simple approach, like I said, we tried a lot of messaging experiments that didn't have a lot of, significant impacts, even in smaller groups. But I think there's more certainly we could do there. And then one thing I'll say, especially about, again, unconsented texting for a second, is like registering your campaigns is super important. So the carriers themselves will block you if you're trying to do mass amounts of texting. So registering your candidate in advance helps with that. I know that also wasn't like directly your question, but and then to some of your questions, we do find, depending on the provider we use, we get slightly different sort of paradata. So we do work to kind of standardize that, although often I'll say within one survey, we're usually only using one provider. So in that sense, it's fairly standardized within that one survey. I think the biggest thing, as always, is really getting under the hood on the dispositions and understanding what they mean. So and categorizing them correctly. I think the biggest one that we don't get as consistently is the red receipt. So the delivery information is kind of the most common that we get really easily, but some of that red information can vary a lot by provider.
Is that because some providers work better with, like, say, an iPhone versus an Android, or is it just they don't collect that, they don't store it, they don't get it sort of back from the the phone companies or whatever, or is it just a choice that they make that they just don't prioritize that data, or do you know?
I don't know fully. I think I'll say like the variation I tend to see is by carrier. So like, and then by device. So like those are the two, like if you kind of group the differences, you tend to see somewhat differences depending on if it's, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, et cetera. And then kind of underneath that, the sort of iPhone, Android piece.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, Mickey's like, I know you got stuff to add.
Oh, I'll just add, we actually did do an experiment last year with sort of an SMS versus MMS where the text was very similar and the only difference in the MMS was the logo. And we didn't really find there was much of a difference between SMS and MMS. It was a study where the sponsor was very, very well recognized in the state where it happens. And so we found that basically mentioning the name of the sponsor in the text had a very large effect, but the additional the additional logo that you get with MMS didn't really have an effect. So for what that's worth, that was just one study though. So I think definitely think more research on that would be helpful. To answer your question for me, Stephanie, so for the one call intervention, I can say a little bit about that. That works. The model for that is a little bit different. So in the 3-call intervention, we're trying to predict future sample productivity. So we've got the models are primarily driven by the paradata. For the 1-call intervention, the model is more like what you would use for weighting. So it's basically the predictors are actually auxiliary variables that capture substantive information about the address, and the dependent variable is whether they have responded. And we cut off the people who have a very high score from that model. So we're essentially stopping dialing for the people who are overrepresented at that point in data collection. So that's much more of a bias model. We actually find that when we evaluated that, we actually found there wasn't much of an impact on the final completion rate. And the impact on sample composition was actually favorable. We saw an improvement in representation of certain subgroups, which is what we were going for by, stopping the people who appeared to be overrepresented at that point. So that as far as sample composition goes, that actually seems to work a little bit better than the 3-call intervention.
Cool.
And I saw you also had a question about just noting that the completion rates were a bit lower in 2021. I can't think of a particular reason why that was the case. I mean, we do see that, as with any annual study, the yields kind of fluctuate from year to year. As far as I can remember, there wasn't any kind of like change in protocol that explained the difference in completion rates. Again, we do try to keep that pretty constant across the 2 pooled years.
I realized after I wrote the question down that your y-axis was actually really tiny, so they weren't actually that different.
Yes, yeah, I should have mentioned that. I kept 0 out of the y-axis just so it was clearer, but yeah, it was only about a 0.5 percentage point difference.
Yeah, it was tiny. Okay, awesome. Do other folks have questions for any of our speakers? Speakers, do you have questions for each other?
I guess I can supplement my answer previously to Stephanie. Another angle I was thinking is that in our particular setting, because the survey implemented randomized design so that the data connected from both modes are representative of the population. But so that I guess it's more comfortable to use only a portion of the data. But in non-randomized design where one mode may represent some population which is not available in another mode, then we definitely recommend using both weighting and imputation to make use of the data connected by most modes. And we consider the approaches proposed in our paper more like a principled approach that can be used accompanying that can be used together with imputation and the weighting approach. I actually have a third chapter using both imputation and these approaches, and I'm happy to talk more about that if there are any questions about how to implement it.
I think that's a really helpful comment that like your work, you're sort of saying you have representative data from both modes so you can make that choice. But when you don't, yeah, that's a super interesting point. Thank you for clarifying that. Other folks, other questions? Diane, hold on one second. There you go. You should be able to unmute now. You're unmuted, but we don't hear you, Diane.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So where did I hear that before? I've been writing a message or in the Q&A to that about establishment surveys and the multi-mode use, especially in the contact strategies. My first point, though, is that the lack of articles in that special issue from established surveys does not indicate the lack of work. It should not be interpreted to indicate the lack of work in that area. So there. But my point there is that, okay, come on, as establishment researchers, we need to get out there and get our work into the published literature. I will say the best, the peer-reviewed literature. You can certainly find a lot of the research about the contact strategies and different modes in specialized conferences like the International Conference on Establishment Surveys. There are a number of other smaller ones that go on in between the ISIS's conferences. There's also, I guess I wouldn't, my point is that you can find that literature or that research in areas where the focus is on established surveys completely. It's harder to get into conferences, for instance, AAPOR, ASA, whatever, about established surveys. There's a lot, there's just a tendency for those conferences to be more general because more of the work and more of the audience is not necessarily established surveys. However, established surveys borrow a lot from what the household side does and then tailors it in the context of establishments. I guess I would say also that we've worked more on the contact strategy side and somewhat less on the procedural side in a measured way. We do a lot of things where we just try it and do it without having a statistical measurement. So, there's the experiential aspect of trying out these different methodologies. And in particular, in the last few years, the Census Bureau, at least, has gone to doing a number of surveys to be very quick turnaround. And so the messaging part is very prominent and very much done electronically by email. I don't know as much about if there's texting going on. I haven't been that into it recently. So but the point is that we do, there's a lot that's done because of the circumstances to be electronic communication, and that we find that business people are prefer that or much, and they also like getting that letter and having that letter sit on their desk and remind them that they have to do something. But in these quick turnaround surveys, it's very important what the messaging is in the emails that invite response. So that's my main, I guess, soapbox today, and just to encourage both the established survey researchers and practitioners to, try to get out there and put our work into the peer-reviewed journals, and for the peer-reviewed journals to be more solicitous of established survey research, and the conferences to be more solicitous. So there you go. There's my parting shot.
Thanks, Dan. I think it's a great point. This research is obviously going on, and I think that was one of the sort of benefits, and Cameron can speak to this too, but I think that was one of the things that was really exciting about the special issue was it was sort of a way for us to try to get work that was maybe being presented at conferences and being developed kind of sort of into a combined journal. So it is unfortunate that we didn't have sort of the level of participation in establishment surveys. But I take your point that there's sort of like habits that have formed around who sort of submits to different journals and conferences and stuff like that.
I'm going to just, for what I wrote, it's not complete in terms of what I just said, but I'm going to send it so that
you just post it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Please do. Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question if folks have questions. Or if not, we can say goodbye. So, okay, I will go ahead and close out. So again, thank you so much to our speakers for your time and your insights today. And thank you for everybody attending the webinar and making this a success. The recording of this event will be available on the DC-AAPOR YouTube channel in the next few days if you want to go back and revisit any of it. For upcoming events, on July 24th, we are having an informal happy hour at Wondergarten Bar in Noma. We'll be excited to see both new and returning DC-AAPOR members. And I think we'll be extra excited to see people this year because so many people were unfortunately unable to travel to St. Louis for the AAPOR National Conference. It'd be great to see you there. I'll be coming down to DC from New York, so I will be there. So I would love to see you. And then finally, save the date and please consider submitting an abstract. The annual DC-AAPOR WSS Expanded Review Preview Conference is scheduled for September 16th. At the Gallup Building on F Street in Washington, D.C. And we're looking not just for, most of you have probably seen our calls. We've typically historically done where we kind of request papers and presentations that have been presented at other conferences. We kind of like to highlight them for our DC-AAPOR community, but we're actually expanding that to other papers that haven't been presented at other conferences because of the number of people who were unable to either submit or had to remove presentations from the from conferences this year just because of changes in conference participation. So with that, I will let you all go. Have a great rest of your day. And again, thanks so much for attending. See ya.